Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at today's webinar that is organized in the framework of our AUTHLIB Neo-authoritarianisms in Europe and the Liberal Democratic Response project. My name is Zsuzsanna Vég. I'm a program officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and I will be chairing this discussion today, which will explore various illiberal trajectories across Western Europe through the examples of Austria, Italy, and France. As we all know, who have been following European politics over the past years, illiberal actors have been on the rise. They are no longer on the fringes of European politics and have been increasingly successful in also entering executive office and influencing not only political discourse, but also policies across the countries of Europe. In the course of the AUTHLIB project, we have been trying to explore the varieties of these illiberal actors and the varieties of illiberal political beliefs held in the societies across Europe. With today's event, we would like to give you a little bit of a taste of our work that we have been conducting over the past 3.5 years. We will be talking about illiberal challengers, what their appeal is, and why people are voting for illiberal parties in Europe. Moreover, over the past years during the project, we have been paying a lot of attention to Central and Eastern European cases. So I'm particularly happy that today we have 3 excellent speakers who are going to dig deeper into Western European and still Central European cases with us today. To explore the topic, we have with us Batuhan Eren, who is a research fellow at the Faculty of Political and Social Sciences at the Scuola Normale Superiore in Italy. And he will be talking about Italy and Italian illiberal actors. We are also joined by Caterina Froio, who is Associate Professor at the Center for European Studies and Comparative Politics at Sciences Po in Paris. Not a surprise, she will be focusing on France. And last but not least, Silvia Kritzinger is joining us from the University of Vienna, where she is a professor at the Department of Government, and she will be focusing on the Austrian case. Of course, we are also very interested in hearing from you, so please make use of the Q&A function throughout the entire event. You can pose your questions, comments, I will be collecting them, and after an initial round of presentations, we'll be bringing you into the discussion as well. Please be aware that the session is recorded and we will make it available on the project YouTube channel and social media channels. So if you don't follow us yet, then please do so. I will be posting our access links in the chat. Without further ado, now I would like to pass the floor first to Silvia to tell us a little bit about illiberalism in Austria, its roots, players, how it has affected politics in the country, and what we should be looking at. Silvia has also, with her colleagues, wrote up a report on this case study, which I will now also be posting in the chat. Silvia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for giving us the opportunity to talk a little bit more about the Austrian case. And I will do so by sharing also some slides with you. Just give me a second. So I think now we should see the slides. Yeah, as Zsuzsanna has already mentioned, we have written a working paper within the framework of the European Horizon Project AUTHLIB, entitled Austria's Democratic Challenges, the Liberal Party Motion and Citizens in Reply. And you will also see the link to the paper in the chat function. So what is it that we're talking about when talking about the case of Austria? Well, Austria has always been considered, according to the VDEM project, a liberal democracy, but this characterization has changed beginning of the 2020 years, namely that it was then classified as an electoral democracy, so lost more or less the status of a liberal democracy of the recent developments over the last 20 years in Austria. And now Austria is entitled an electoral democracy. There are a couple of events that you're probably aware of, but I would like to raise the attention again to what was going on in Austria in the last couple of years. The most important event was probably the general election in 2024, in September 2024, where for the first time after World War II, the illiberal radical right, FPÖ, became the strongest party. Altogether, they got 28.8% of the vote share and were therefore the first in the election, and so to speak, an election winner. But this is probably just the final point in a development that could be seen since the 1980s, 1990s, namely that the FPÖ since then became a very important political actor in the Austrian political scene, starting with Jörg Haier in the 1980s, taking over the then more liberal FPÖ and reshaping it more and more into what we first called the populist right and then a populist radical right. And they have reshaped the political discourse quite substantially over the last decade, so to speak. And also when it comes then to practices, this discourse can also be seen in the practices that change quite substantially, namely that especially once they took over power in the 2017, together with the ÖVP, being the junior partner in the then coalition, they tried to somehow reshape the institutional independence, for example, of the security services, but they also tried to politicize the security agencies in general, and eventually also quite some policies in the realm of immigration policy, where they tried to restrict the minority rights. Core elements of liberal democracies. Nevertheless, liberal democracies have possibilities to respond to some of those attacks, and we could see that these possibilities were also taken into consideration, most and foremost by the judicial oversight, but the Constitutional Court, which somehow pushed back on some of the reform ideas that the FPÖ put forward, especially while being in the government with the then ÖVP of Sebastian Kurz. But also coalition dynamics are important, because even though FPÖ scored first after the last national election, and therefore one could imagine then being the winner of an election, also then being in the position to hold the chancellorship. Nevertheless, the other parties refrained from building a coalition with the FPÖ, so to speak, building a cordon sanitaire around the FPÖ, not allowing the FPÖ to go into the government, which of course created lots of debates in the sense of whether this is democratic or not democratic. And there are debates about what to do with an election winner, whether to exclude it or not. But in proportional systems, there are normally two stages in order to be a winner after an election. First, on election day in the evening, whether we actually are having most votes, and then secondly, whether you're actually also making it into the coalition formation process, because 28% of the votes do not give you 50% of the mandates there. So therefore, you always need a coalition partner in order to be able to also be in the governing seat. But let me also show you a little bit what is going on with regards to the positioning of the FPÖ over time. And here you see data from the CHESS expert survey and two parties, namely the FPÖ, which is having the blue dots, and the ÖVP, which has having the turquoise dots. And you can see that on the GAL 10 dimension, which is GAL, which is green alternative liberal on the one hand, versus TAN, which is traditional authoritarian nationalist on the other hand, scoring from 0 to 10, that the FPÖ is scoring very much on the TAN dimension, in the sense that experts score them as a very traditional authoritarian nationalist party as such. And you see that in 2002, but also then in 2006, this party scored very high on that dimension and never really moved away from this very 10 position until 2024, therefore really being the perfect party that we normally would call a liberal radical right party. But let us look a little bit more into the ideological stances of the FPÖ. And if we start the party manifestos, then you can see that the party has very strong illiberal components in the party manifesto that they then try to put into politics, into policy making, especially once they're forming government, mainly with the ÖVP in Austria. They are strongly supporting the executive power without a restraint. So therefore, minority rights are not really something they are considering too much, in the sense that the majority should rule. This is a very populist argument that we have heard from many other populist actors so far. And what we also see is that they see the rule of law element differently than what liberal democracies actually should do, namely that they think that politics, and here especially the government, should have the authority to control the judiciary. So again, one of the core elements of liberal democracy that the FPÖ is not trying to follow, making it even more plausible why Austria has been characterized nowadays an electoral democracy and not a liberal democracy any longer. And they have lots of illiberal stances, according to what the AUTHLIB project defines as illiberal stances, namely that they really would like to have power concentration. They really would like to prioritize Austrians over other ethnic groups when it comes to redistributive policies. And they're also very much in favor of a closed societies, a nativist society, really belonging to the Austrians, trying to somehow making a border towards non-Austrians as such. So this is a little bit the party side, but now let's look into the voter side. And based on the AUTHLIB survey that we did in the summer of 2024, so before the last national election in Austria, we see that when it comes to the polity dimension, so what are the democratic principles of Austrians, especially FPÖ voters in Austria, we looked into several aspects. Let me start with the media criticism of government. We asked simply whether the media should be allowed to criticize the government. And you see that there we don't see many differences between voters for the FPÖ versus all other voters. The voters in Austria are very much in favor that the media should be able to criticize the government. But once we're looking a little bit closer into other aspects like minority protection, in the sense whether people should, or whether the democracy should protect minorities, we see already first differences, in the sense that FPÖ voters are less likely to somehow support the notion that liberal democracies should protect all types of minorities that are living in a democratic state. We're moving forward when it comes to immigrants and the economy, namely whether the immigrants are good for the economic status of Austria. And here we see huge differences between the voters of the FPÖ versus the other voters. Namely that the FPÖ voters don't think that the immigrants are doing any good to the Austrian economy. But this is very different to the other voters, namely the FPÖ voters, non-FPÖ voters, where the voters for other parties actually say that immigrants are important for the economy and are helping the Austrian economy to move forward. So there we see already the main difference between FPÖ voters versus all other voters. Now we're moving into the main differences as such, namely with when looking at satisfaction with democracy. And you see a kind of a polarization going on there, namely the FPÖ voters not being satisfied with how democracy is working in Austria at the moment, while all the other voters are more satisfied. I wouldn't say that they are super satisfied with how the democracy works currently, but at least you don't see this very dissatisfaction amongst those voters compared to the FPÖ voters. And we can continue when we look into democratic trust in different democratic institutions. And let me just tell you that we didn't just ask about the legal system, we also asked about the parliament, the government, and so on. And also on these institutions, we see a huge discrepancy between FPÖ voters versus non-FPÖ voters, namely that the FPÖ voters are generally less trustful towards the democratic institutions than the other voters. And we can see that especially when it comes to the legal system, that FPÖ voters trust the legal system much less than, for example, other voters. And this is kind of worrisome because, of course, we can say because of partisanship and so on, that voters of parties not in government do not trust the government, the parliament, to a large extent, or not to the extent that the other voters. But the legal system should be a little bit above partisanship, but even there we see this strong polarization, showing that this rhetoric of the FPÖ obviously is taken up by their voters in the sense that politics should make the rules and the judicial system should follow them, so that the rule of law is somehow changing. And we can see that the voters obviously take that a little bit into account when judging how the legal system nowadays works and how trustful or how much trust you can put towards the legal system in such moments. So the rhetoric seems to somehow work also for their voters. When it comes to political correctness, we can say that also here, the voters of the FPÖ are different from the other voters. We ask whether people have the feeling that they can say anything they wish nowadays, especially moving now into this wokeness. And we see that FPÖ voters have the notion that they cannot say anything any longer without being punished. So therefore, also that the free speech is somehow not working as it used to work in the past. So what are some conclusions that we can then discuss further later on? First of all, we can say that FPÖ voters certainly do think that democratic principles are important, but they do not perceive democratic reality in such a way that democratic reality caters to these democratic norms, to these democratic principles that they actually would like to see. Now, of course, we can say that democratic reality and democratic perceptions are probably not really overlapping, especially amongst this group of voters. And this, of course, then has major repercussions in their notion of satisfaction with democracy and also trust in institutions, which in the long term may create problems in the sense that they are not really following the democratic status any longer. And finally, FPÖ voters have a strong sense of cultural marginalization. And all of this shows a little bit that this rhetoric that I started my presentation with is really diffusing more and more from the party side to the voters, in the sense that what the FPÖ did over years, decades, in their rhetoric, in the sense that the democratic institutions do not work, that there is a corrupt elite governing the country, and that people are not allowed to say any longer what they wish to say, is now also more and more visible amongst voters, especially amongst their voters. And therefore, we do see that this might create long-term problems. And also this notion by the FPÖ that we need to go for a fundamental disruption of the existing system seems to resonate very well amongst the voters and may create problems in the long term, which are kind of worrisome. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. I think it was very interesting, and thank you for also pointing out some of the main challenges, the role of the main illiberal challengers' rhetoric in shaping voters' perspectives. That's something that we might want to come back to a little bit later. I noted down already a couple questions and would also encourage our audience to share your comments, questions in the Q&A that is at the bottom of the window. Also on the go, you don't need to wait until we start the Q&A session. I will be collecting your input. But before we move there, I would like to now turn to Batukan to discuss the Italian case, and you may see a little bit of progression here. We started from Austria that had far-right parties in government already before. We are now moving to a case where the far-right is currently in power. Batukan, the floor is yours. And I see your presentation already.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joanna, for this great introduction, and thank you so much, Sylvia, for this great presentation on Austria. And well, I would like to start with a disclaimer, because I cannot consider myself as an expert on Italian politics, which is very, very complex. So there may be issues that are beyond my knowledge, but what we have done in AUTHLIB project in the last couple of years is to analyze Italy as a country with the context of the recent rise of far-right and illiberal politics and their transnationalization across Europe. Because as these images show, over the past 2 decades, the far-right actors have increasingly engaged in transnational activities, ranging from alliance formation in the European Parliament to the organization of joint street protests, exchanging ideas, strategies, tactics to increase their influence and legitimacy. And again, as these images show, Italian far-right actors or illiberal actors or populist actors are present in these activities, sometimes initiating it, sometimes participating in it, but most of the time being the active agents of these rise of current far-right trend across Europe and beyond. So we can easily claim that Italy is one of the most important countries for understanding these rise and normalization of far-right, populist and illiberal politics in the Europe today. And this is not only because Italy is currently governed by a far-right government, Fratelli d'Italia, or Brothers of Italy in English, but because the country combines a long history of historical legacy of fascism and post-fascism with a remarkably diverse and active contemporary far-right ecosystem that also functions beyond the national borders. So to understand what's happening today, we need to move beyond the focus on elections only and look at the broader political environment in which far-right ideas can be easily produced, circulated, and normalized, both in Italy and beyond it. So Italy's relationship with the far right did not begin in the recent years. The country experienced 2 decades of fascist dictatorship under Mussolini, and unlike some other European contexts, post-war period did not fully marginalize the far-right political traditions, I think we can say it. Parties such as Italian Social Movement or National Alliance kept post-fascist ideas alive while within the democratic system, and over time these traditions evolved rather than disappeared completely. So what we see today is not a return of the past, of course, in an identical form, but a reconfiguration and revision of the older ideas into new political languages, strategies, and organizational forms as well as alliances. So the current moment must be understood, against the backdrop of the multiple crises and these historical legacy. The economic stagnation following 2008 financial crisis, long-standing debates over migration during 2010s, the COVID-19 pandemic during 2020s, 2020 and 2020s in general, yes, and the declining trust in political institutions, especially since 1990s. So this crisis, combined with this, historical legacy, created a fertile ground for actors who present themselves as the defenders of the order, tradition, and the common sense against political elites and the perceived external threats, which were considered as the main reasons for these times of crisis. So this context helps to explain the rise of Giorgia Meloni and her party in the current situation, because Meloni came to power in 2022 after the collapse of Mario Draghi's technocratic national unity government. While most parties actually participated in that government in Italy, the main parties, the Brothers of Italy remained in opposition. So this allowed Meloni to position herself as the only consistent alternative to what she framed as an elite consensus politics. And her success also lies in her ability to combine the continuity and change. So while continuity with the post-fascist traditions on the issues such as nationalism, migration, family, traditional values, and change in style, presentation, and leadership form. Because Meloni has carefully avoided overt references to fascism directly, while at the same time she embraced strong symbolic language around God, homeland, and family. As Italy's first female prime minister, she has also challenged the expectations in traditional male-dominated political space, and present herself both as a conservative, charismatic leader and a symbol of renewal. At the same time, she has worked to reassure both domestic and international audiences by adopting a more pragmatic style, maintaining Italy's support to Ukraine and NATO, and cooperating closely with European Union, or being a mediator role between the US and also Europe, but also liberals and illiberals within European countries, among European countries, and framing her, as hardline migration policies as security issues rather than solely ideology. So her government also benefited relatively from the economic stable performance, and which is marked by the continued access to EU recovery funds and declining unemployment and public debt, and which also reinforced the public perception around her based on competence and stability. So this strategic balancing has helped Meloni to move from a political margins into the mainstream, winning around 26% of the vote in 2022 and maintaining high levels of support since then. As we can see here in these, in these graphs, in these opinion polls, she's around 30%, which is kind of a historical success in Italian politics for a party. And alongside Brothers of Italy, parties like Lega, or Lega Nord originally, have also played a central role in shaping the populist and exclusionary discourses in the recent decades. Under especially Matteo Salvini, who came to power in 2013, the party, transformed from a regionalist party into a more ethno-nationalist and right-wing populist one during the 2010s. Particularly focused on migration, security, opposition to political elites. Even when electoral support fluctuates or decreased, as again we can see in this picture in the green red, the cultural impact of Salvini's Lega remains significant even in today's political context. But the important point about Italy is that focusing only on Meloni or Salvini or any other major party-based figures would give us a kind of incomplete picture, because far-right politics in Italy is not confined to parliament. Beyond institutional politics, Italy hosts some of Europe's most active, illiberal or far-right movements. So it is better to understood as an ecosystem, or maybe as a community that includes political parties, movements, grassroots organizations, civil society actors, and transnational networks that function in a sometimes collaborative, sometimes competitive, but always active way. So in this ecosystem, groups such as Casa Pound or Forza Nuova, for example, operate through a mix of street activism, social initiatives, symbolic politics, and online communication. They organize demonstrations, occupy buildings, patrol neighborhoods, not only in Italy, but also they participate in transnational events and also sometimes organize them. So especially during the pandemic, many of these actors that can be considered as far-right aligned themselves with anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination protests, embedding far-right narratives within both broader social content and reach a broader, social audience. And one particularly influential area of mobilization in Italy in recent years is also the anti-gender and pro-family movement, because this includes organizations that oppose abortion, LGBTQI rights, gender equality policies, often framing these issues as foreign impositions or the ideological threats to children and national identity or traditional values. So while these actors present themselves as part of civil society, like the actors like Provita, for example, they're closely connected to these far-right politics and have been successful in shaping public debates and influencing policy agendas as well. Because under the current government, some of these narratives and some of these activities have moved close to the, more governmental level and state power. So policies and administrative practices that affect same-sex families, reproductive rights, gender equality, or migration issues, such as the attempts to externalize asylum processes in Albania, and also public criticisms of judges and journalists have contributed to these, warnings about democratic backsliding in Italy. And under these circumstances, Italy is now considered as a flawed democracy, and it's identified as a country at risk of a further democratic erosion and, autocratization. This does not mean that Italy is no longer democracy, of course, but it does indicate a gradual weakening of the, liberal institutions or institutional independence of liberal actors and pluralism. And importantly, as we also discussed in the counter paper that you can see in AUTHLIB website, the public support for far-right and populist actors remains substantial. As I have demonstrated, the opinion polls demonstrate a full support, increasing support to Meloni's party, but also surveys shows that voters of parties like Brothers of Italy and Lega are more open to illiberal or sometimes authoritarian ideas and less committed to the, democratic values than the national average compared to other political parties. So while explicit support for fascism or post-fascism, let's say, remains in the minority positions in these polls, tolerance for illiberal solutions or, strong men or, that kind of more autocratic solutions to the social and political issues is significantly higher within these electorates of Lega and Brothers of Italy compared to other parties. So this suggests that far-right success is not only a political phenomenon, but also, a social and cultural one. And this impact, as I also discussed, is beyond the national borders, because it can be argued as, or we argue that Italy is one of the, locomotives or hubs of far-right and illiberal politics in the region. So Meloni and Salvini are central figures in the transnational far right, shaping alliances across Europe and beyond. Salvini's Lega has been very active in the Identity and Democracy and Patriots for Europe, European Parliament groups, while Meloni works closely with the leaders like Viktor Orban or Donald Trump. Now she's considered as the mediator between the US and the European Union, which is a very, very important role, actually. It shows, actually, her impact in transnational politics. Her foreign policy combines pragmatist and populist personalization. It maintains, as I said, strong ties with the United States and making Meloni a key figure in international politics today. She also engaged cautiously with European Union, balancing again liberal and illiberal actors as a mediating figure, while also remaining very illiberal and far right in her discourses. And non-party actors such as Provita or Movimento Nazionale or Forza Nuova, again, as I mentioned, are well connected with the foreign actors in both online and offline forms, and they have successfully organized or participated in various transnational events that in Italy that attracted an international audience, such as the Fortress Fest organized in Verona in 2023, or the World Family Congress, mostly held in Verona again in 2019 and in other years as well. So considering all these points, we can claim that, Italy can be considered as a hub for this transnationalization of the far right, with its active ecosystem that creates opportunities and favorable conditions for far-right actors from different countries to collaborate and cooperate. And under these circumstances, briefly, the question is then, what to do, how to challenge this illiberal and far-right surge. Because Italy, today we discussed about the rise of far-right politics and illiberal actors, but Italy is not a story of democratic decline alone. It's a country where democratic actors, social movements, civil society actors continue to mobilize and resist to the illiberal surge. Yes, there is a community of illiberal and far-right actors, and there is an historical legacy, but there is also a very strong historical legacy and community of progressive actors as well. So there is things to do. There's things that can be done actually in the current situation, and I think this can be discussed in the discussion in general, in public discussion in general. But I think one of the issues is to is to stop treating far-right actors as purely electoral problem. Elections matter, but the far-right, as we explained, influences extend, the far-right influence extends beyond the, political elections. Democratic actors need to pay greater attention to the movements, civil society organizations, online spaces, transnational networks, where far-right ideas are produced and circulated. So monitoring and understanding these spaces, I think, is a precondition for effective response. And another issue is the democratic and progressive forces need to engage seriously with the issues that far-right actors dominate, rather than avoiding them, like migration, security, family policy, maybe, or social policies cannot be left exclusively to the exclusionary narratives. Counter narratives must be grounded in lived experiences, speak in accessible language, and offer credible solutions that address people's concern, without fear mongering. So, more engagement with these issues in spaces where different, public audiences exist. This is one of the issues, and alliances matter as the last point that I can mention, because as we have discussed in this paper and in this project, far-right actors cooperate across borders, learn from each other, and share strategies. And progressive actors must also do the same. Stronger cooperation between NGOs, journalists, academics, trade unions, intellectuals, political forces and parties, both national and transnationally, is essential. So Italy's own experience shows that broad-based organizations and mobilizations, such as the 2019 Sardine protests, for example, can successfully challenge far-right discourse, illiberal discourse, when they resonate culturally and emotionally. So Italy, I think, today stands at the crossroads. It's a country where far-right actors have gained, a very important institutional power, but also, as I mentioned, it's a country with a strong traditions of resistance, solidarity, and democratic engagement. So with proper strategies, this can be challenged very well. I will stop here, and we can continue discussing later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Batuhan. I posted the case study in the chat, so I would like to encourage our audience to check it out. It covers a lot of ground, as you have just heard, and indeed one very specific and interesting angle that the Italian case study has brought out is the increasing transnationalization of the far right, and this yet again may be a topic that we can circle back, but also Batuhan raised points about what may be done, which I think is also very worthwhile of exploring in this round. Before that, I would like to pass the floor now to Katarina, whose paper written together with the Sciences Po team of AUTHLIB, I will also post in the chat, to explore the French case, moving on to a country where the far right is not in executive office for now, but that may eventually change in the not so distant future. Katarina, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Susanna. Thanks, Sylvia and Batuhan, for your presentations. And I think that the French case will nicely complement your arguments. So first of all, this is joint work that has been done in the framework of the AUTHLIB project with my colleagues Elena Cosso, now based at the European University Institute, Roman Lasha and Jan Rovny, who are here with me in Sciences Po. In the framework of the AUTHLIB project, we were asked to examine illiberal trends in the context of French politics. But why French politics then? Why should we study France in the framework of a research project interested in studying neo-authoritarianism and illiberalism? It is because, differently from Austria and Italy, France is a case where the far right or illiberal actors have never been in office, at least at the national level so far. And on top of that, France is a particularly interesting case because it's a case that shows very resilient political institutions, but in a context of growing normative contestation. What does it mean? It means that actually French institutions have been stable after the end of the war. There have not been reforms that threaten directly, at least, the quality of democracy in the country. At the same time, as you will see in a moment from our study, we witness in France growing normative contestation towards democracy, towards the role of political parties, and towards the formal channels of political representations. Now, the goal of our report here was exactly to examine the origins, sources, and forms of this growing normative contestation of democracy among elite politics. So by looking at what political parties say and do, but also at the level of mass politics. So by looking at people, individuals, citizens. Therefore, our core question for this work has been really to try to understand to what extent and how is liberal democracy contested in a case like France, characterized by strong institutional stability, differently from, for example, from what we see in some Eastern European countries, but at the same time, growing normative contestation. In order to do that, like my colleagues before, we relied on the data that has been produced in the framework of the AUTHLIB project. And we decided actually to focus on two complementary dimensions of elite and mass politics in order to shed light on the French case. So first of all, we wanted to look at the formal, institutional, the discourse that political actors put forward and the support that people have towards institutional check and balances, right? That the constraints on executive power and judicial independence that are very classic benchmarks when it comes to study illiberalism at the institutional level. At the same time, we also wanted to complement this more institutional focus with a broader focus on changes in public debates and policy agendas that can be less visible through than formal institutional reforms, but that can have an impact nevertheless on the ways in which support for democracy unfolds in this case. For this, we use the data coming from expert surveys, the Chapelil expert surveys collected in the framework of the AUTHLIB project, as well as survey data. And we also use some contextual and qualitative data coming from newspapers to put in context these broad trends, and also party press releases and websites. Let's start then from the political elite story, right? So on what you can see on this slide is the level of party support for liberal democracy in Europe, measured in 2024. And this is important because it allows us to situate France a bit in the European context, right? So on the graph, you see a score of support for liberal democracy, ranging from more negative values on the left to more positive values. And if you have very good eyes, you can see actually that France is actually slightly below the EU average. But at the same time, it is pretty comparable to the case of Austria that Silvia discussed, Italy that Batuan discussed, and also Slovenia. So if we place France in the European context, we could say that it's not, let's say, a standing out case of illiberal contestation of democracy. But then let's try to zoom on the challenges, the internal challenges to democracy, right? So what happens inside French politics. Here, what we did, it was basically to measure support for liberal democracy by French parties. You have always a score, an index of support for liberal democracy ranging from lower levels of support on the left to highest level of support on the right. And on the other axis, you have the names of the parties that we ranked starting from the green, and then the left, the centrists, the liberals, and the two far-right parties. As you can see, actually, and perhaps unsurprisingly, far-right actors that are the Rassemblement National and Reconquête, the party led by journalist Éric Zemmour, are those actually who score lower when it comes to support for democracy. Left and green parties on top of the graph are those that seem to form the strongest pro-democracy bloc. At the same time, what is particularly interesting is that the conservatives located here in the middle, and in particular Les Républicains, they actually score moderately below the center. So when we look at contestation of democracy inside the French party system, we are not surprised to find a contestation by the far right, but we see that actually conservatives, mainstream conservative parties, are also those who are progressively eroding their support for democracy. We then wanted to also understand what are the issues, right, that go with a critique and illiberalism in France. And in order to do that, we considered 4 issues that have achieved growing importance in public debates in France: LGBTQI plus rights, protectionism, support for Russia, and opposition to immigration. Here again, the French political space seemed to be divided, let's say, in 4 blocks. On the one hand, we have here at the bottom of all the graph, the far-right cluster that basically combines strong protectionist, nationalist, and pro-Russian orientations with lower level of support for democracy. The Green, the Socialist, and the Radical Left, they somehow occupy the high ground of democratic support in the French party system, displaying actually strong support for LGBTQI plus rights and other issues. The Liberals are, let's say, closer to the left when it comes to support for democracy. But again, what we see is that conservatives, and in particular Les Républicains, they score lower than other mainstream parties. And this is in particularly due to their more radical stances on immigration and nationalism. So what we see here is that the issue priorities of political parties align closely with democratic support. And again, I mean, the key take-home message from that is that contestation of democracy, at least in the French party system and in the French political space, seems to come more from conservative, mainstream conservative parties rather than other parts of the political spectrum on top of the classic far-right contestation. We also, in our study, tried to put these tendencies in context, and we looked at the ways in which the Front National itself shapes norms and policies in the French political system. The formal channels are perhaps the most evident. Today, the Rassemblement National in the French Parliament has 123, 126 out of 577 MPs. And it has actually benefited a lot of the fragmentation of the conservative right, Les Républicains. So rather than being able to redirect policies, the party very often sides with a fringe of and a group of the conservative Les Républicains that is undergoing major internal fragmentation. And in terms of formal influence on policies and politics, the Front National rules today at the local level, some cities, and in these cases, studies show that budget allocations translate pretty clearly the nationalist priorities of the party and measures that are exclusionary, especially when it comes to the integration of ethnic and religious minorities. The influence of the Front National on the erosion of support for democracy in the French party system is also evident through discursive strategies in public debates. This has been the case especially for ongoing political debates about a trial that Marine Le Pen, the former leader of the Rassemblement National, is undergoing. She basically has been condemned in the first stance, and she's now appealing. But during the months of the trials, she has contributed to spread very critical discourse towards the action of the judges by saying that basically the judges are taking over the right of French citizens to choose air at the next presidential elections in 2027. The influence of the Rassemblement National on political debates in France is particularly evident when it comes to debates, public debates on immigration, and in particular on the presence of Muslim minorities in France, and more recently also on universities and gender equality. I'm happy to discuss these cases further if you have any questions. There have also been studies that have demonstrated that the informal influence of the Rassemblement National and of the far right on the French political system can be found also in some, as Batuan was saying, social movements that have been particularly important also for the party in terms of providing personnel for the party for elections, especially at the local level, but also media ecosystems and online influencers. Let me move now to the mass attitudes towards democracy and to the mass dimension of contestation of democracy in France today. Here again, we use survey data from AUTHLIB, and in particular, we measure populist, illiberal, and authoritarian orientations. But when we speak about populism, populist attitudes, we refer mostly to anti-elite attitudes. When we speak about illiberal attitudes, we refer mostly to nationalist and exclusionary beliefs. And when we speak about authoritarian attitudes, we mostly refer to support for strong and unconstrained leadership. Again, this first slide allows you to locate France in the broader EU context. And you can see that France is near the EU average when it comes to populism and illiberalism, but when it comes to authoritarian values, it scores comparatively high. It is second only to Italy, as was already discussed by Batuan. And interestingly enough, far-right voters are those who score highest on all the three dimensions. When it comes to the social-demographic divides that drive support for democracy, we found actually three main trends. So people with lower level of educations are associated in general with higher populist, illiberal, and authoritarian values. It appears that in the French context, it is still working class groups that tend to be more receptive to illiberal narratives, but we couldn't really understand why. For the moment, it's an open question that we have. And interestingly enough, we found that age effects vary by dimensions, right? So younger cohorts tend to be less populist than older groups, but they have also highest level of endorsement of authoritarian views, which is something that a puzzle that future research should address. We also found in the data that illiberal parties mobilize constituencies that are already receptive. So they are better in mobilizing people who are already dissatisfied, let's say, with democracy. I will shortly close because my time is over, but what I did here, it was to introduce you to the case of France, that is this case of resilient institutions but growing normative contestation. And I've shown to you how the channels through which both at the elite level and mass politics level contestation unfolds. The main critical junctures ahead in French politics will be the 2026 and to the municipal elections and the 2027 presidential elections. And what we have to watch from very close here will be whether this gap between constitutional protections that are still in place and informal norm erosion will grow or whether it will shrink. And much will depend probably on the configuration of the political coalitions that we run for the French presidency. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, Catherine. This was an excellent overview. And I would yet again encourage our participants to share their questions. But as I already have a few, I would maybe go ahead and abuse my position as the moderator and ask you a couple first ones. And maybe doing so, I would like to bring Sylvia and Katerina into conversation with each other as a start, because both of you actually touched on the resonance of certain illiberal authoritarian positions the challenger parties are advocating or pursuing, and the voters' attitudes to democratic values, principles, and so on. And this is the classic question of how the supply and the demand relates to each other, what drives what. And Sylvia's take from, if I understood it correctly, was more that the illiberal propositions of FPÖ is increasingly resonating in the population, and we see that the dissatisfaction of democracy is higher among the FPÖ voters. But my reading from what you presented was that it's more of a supply-driven, a party-driven attitude in the public. And Katerina, you concluded by saying that illiberal parties mobilize receptive audiences who are already dissatisfied. Now, can we square the circle here? Chicken and egg question. What comes first? Is it maybe country specific, or can we identify some overarching trends nowadays in Europe in this regard? Maybe Sylvia, I would give you the floor first to give Katerina a moment to catch her breath after the presentation.
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very difficult one because it's a question about causality or chicken and egg, as you mentioned that. And of course, our analysis has not really looked into this aspect of causality, what comes first, what is driving what. Is it voters driving parties or parties driving voters? And our more descriptive view on the Austrian case gives kind of indication that it seems that it's a more supply side driven development, in the sense that there was a party that became really powerful and important by the beginning of the 1990s. They changed the norms both when it comes to social norms as well as democratic norms of what is possible to say and what is not possible to say. And this is something that we can observe probably not only in Austria, but also in other countries, let's say, for example, the Netherlands, that, for example, in the 1990s, it was more common to know what can be said and what cannot be said when it comes to social norm violation. And here I'm talking really about social norm violation. And this has gradually shifted over the last 20 to 30 years, in the sense that nowadays things can be said that the people were not allowed to be said. And so the parties pushed a little bit on these norms. So they go one step in front, and then they got half a step back, and they continued doing this game for quite some time, which also then was moving into democratic practices, also using populist arguments of the corrupt elite, not catering to the needs of the population of the country, but catering to the needs of people coming to Austria, coming to the country, and also therefore giving a lot of hard times to the institutions, like, for example, the courts. The courts are somehow moving more along the needs of the non-Austrians than along the needs of the Austrians, and the party, the FPÖ, or the right-wing parties, the populist actors, really playing this field very nicely. So coming to a conclusion, I would probably say the developments that we could observe over the last 30 years would probably tell me that it's more a supply side driven development that voters picked up. And there is actually also economic evidence which shows to a certain extent that things are not going that bad economically or in the welfare state and stuff like that. But there is a strong rhetoric from certain political actors providing the citizens with the perception that everything is going down the tubes, both in the welfare state as well as in the economy. And this is coming from somewhere. This is coming from political actors raising expectations, high expectations, also raising the expectations that the elites are only working for them, and also raising expectations towards science, as we are here, in the sense that we are also part of that elite, not working really for the people, so that we also find a lot of science skepticism, making our position even more difficult, because whatever we are saying, we are also moving into this rhetoric, being one of the corrupt science elite that is not really in favor of what the people need nowadays. So yes, I would say it's elite-driven, supply-side-driven change that we observe here over long term. And this is very important. It's not that it has changed overnight, it has changed over 20, 30 years.
Thank you very much. Katarina, would you add anything to this?
Yes. So first of all, as Silvia said, in our report we didn't trace causality. So what I'm going to say is based on, my understanding of the case rather than what we claim in the report. Despite the differences that you detected, Susanna, in terms of appeal towards illiberal campaigns and claim, I agree with between Austria and France. I agree that the story here seems to be way more supply side based than demand side based, and I completely agree with what Silvia was saying before. I will just add perhaps something else to push the discussion a bit further, hopefully, and that is actually the supply side story is a supply side story that mostly, and it is evident in the case of France, is about the contagion between the far right and the mainstream right. These dynamics of contagion between the mainstream right and the far right is something that we are witnessing also outside Europe, outside France, of course, and outside Europe. The case of the United States in this respect is particularly telling. In a bipartisan system, we don't see the emergence of a third far-right illiberal party, but we see that actually parts of illiberalism and parts of the far-right enter mainstream parties. In the configuration of European party systems, what we see instead is rather that far-right parties and illiberal challengers emerge as a sort of third pole, autonomous, such as is the case of the Rassemblement National, the FPO, Fratelli d'Italia, and so forth. So what I wanted to add is this is a supply side story that has much to do with the contagion between the far right and the conservative right, which has also much to do with the fragmentation inside the conservatives, the conservative party. This is particularly evident in the case of France. And among the consequences of this, as Silvia mentioned, there is a change in the norms of democracy, the way in which we talk about democracy. There is a change in the way in which we discuss issues that are at the core of far-right campaigns, immigration. But there is also another process that for me is interesting, and it is the appropriation by the far-right of specific issues that used to be very mainstream, right? I think about, in the case of France, this would be the case of secularism, laïcité. In the case of the US or other European countries, this could be the case of the issue of freedom of speech, right? In France, secularism has been historically an issue that was supposed to be the common agreement of the social contract in French society, right? So secularism was meant
to preserve minorities, especially religious minorities, from discrimination. Now, the meaning of secularism in contemporary political debates has been shifting dramatically. Secularism is now a flagship issue of the Rassemblement National that politicizes it to challenge and to attack especially Muslim minorities in the country. And a similar dynamic appears elsewhere in the context of another issue that used to be what we call in political science a valence issue, right? An issue over which everyone would agree, and that is debates over freedom of speech, right? So originally, this idea of freedom of speech was meant to promote inclusion and to give voice to different points of view, and so promote, like debate, even critical debate. But today, what we see is that the far right is using this concept to challenge anti-discrimination norms, to challenge equity policies, and also minority protections, portraying dominant groups as silenced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say, and in this respect, here again, the contagion between these issues, I spoke about laïcité, I speak about freedom of speech, but we could also speak about science, as Silvia said, or also the alleged wokeism in universities. These are issues over which the bridge between and the borders between mainstream conservatives and the far right are progressively eroding. So just to complement what Silvia was saying, I would say, yes, it's a supply side story, and it's a supply side story that, in my understanding at least, has much to do with the dynamics and competition between the mainstream conservatives and the far right, and the way in which this competition is built across issues that are not only immigration anymore, but these are issues that used to be consensual and that are now politicized and polarized.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And indeed, it's very important that you highlighted the role of the mainstream in the rise of the far right. I think beyond the fragmentation and the contagion, highlighting these dynamics, what generally I think political science focusing on this sort of dynamics between far right and mainstream parties typically tends to agree on is that mainstream right parties co-opting the far right's rhetoric positions in the hopes that they will curtail the liberal challengers is always backfiring. It weakens the mainstream, it hollows out their programs, and ultimately fuels the further rise of the far right. But you also talked about the politicization of various issues, freedom of speech, laïcité, science, and so on and so forth. And here I would like to bring in Batuhan, because I think we can note about this that this is pretty much a transnational phenomenon these days. And this is what you study more closely. And I wanted to ask you why you think the transnationalization of far-right narratives seems to be so successful these days. Is it really that successful? Or is it just a portrayal, an impression that in a highly mediatized digital world we take away, or is there really substance behind it? Do we see the emergence of transnational, illiberal, international, far-right, international, if you will?
Well, this is a great question, and yes, it is real, and it's an important issue, actually, because in our research also we checked which type of frames and discourses that far-right actors in different countries use similarly, and we have seen actually the use of very common phrases like gender ideology, the very basic one, or the framing strategies that originate in one country and that is adopted by other countries' far-right figures as well. And this is why actually we also want to understand how these transnationalization is a multidimensional process, because when you look at it, you can see that there is these transnational networks which are mostly online that happens in online platforms and function as perfect dimension for these exchange of ideas. But also there's transnational activities, in-person meetings in which these actors come together, they create new ideas, they spread them through these networks, both in online and offline platforms. And at the center, yes, there is these common strategies and frames. Just a very clear example that we also have discussed in our recent paper is the anti-woke position. Because now it emerged in the US context, it's originated there. But when you look at the European politics today, it has become one of the most common framing strategy that is used by not only the high-level political figures like Meloni or Orban, but also in other levels as well. When you look at the civil society actors like in the event of CPAC Hungary, that happens every year, you can clearly see how they invest a lot in these construction of new frames and ideas, and also disseminate them, spread them through their networks. When you look at the street level protest, or when you look at the Facebook groups, which I check regularly, you can again see how these framing strategies are very normalized and adapted by different actors in different countries. Because actually, it gives you, we call them as master frames. You can use it to discuss anything, and more importantly, you can use them to attack anyone. This event is a woke event, or you can be a lifelong feminist for 50 years, but you can still have woke, at the end of the day. So you don't need to think a lot about actually what woke means, but you can use it for anti-immigration, for feminism, for LGBTQI rights, or for minority rights defenders. And it is very basic, it is very vague, and it can mobilize people around a very, vague concept to criticize any type of progressive movements. This is why we need to actually understand this transnationalization of frames and ideas, because it creates these intellectual weapons to be used in different battlefronts by different type of actors. So I think we need to take it very seriously, and I think the progressives should also invest much more intellectual work to create similar strategies, because I don't think any examples that become very popular or transnationally spread like anti-wokeness or gender ideology. So more intellectual work is there to be done for progressives to challenge these ideas.
Thank you very much, Batuhan, both for highlighting the incredible impact of this discursive alliance that is emerging across countries, but also to pointing to the need for counteraction. And I could not agree more with the notion that there is need for a broad coalition of actors, from academics to analysts, scholars, democratic parties, civil society, and democratically minded citizens to double down on their stance for democracy. Now, we in our discussion now talked about the roots of the appeal, the supply-demand side interaction, and started to touch on the discursive impact. And in your contributions to various degrees, you also mentioned what kind of impact the far-right actors in question had on policy. And I wanted to tease that out a little bit more, not just to pinpoint that this is the impact on this policy area, but to try to maybe decipher a little bit under what conditions can be observed successful implementation of the positions and policy agendas of these far-right actors when they get access to office. Now, I know that this moves beyond what's in the reports, and that's perfectly fine. But I wanted to ask you to maybe root it in the country cases that you know best, speculate a little bit. What are the main enabling and constraining factors around radical right parties' impact? May I ask Sylvia to jump in on it?
Certainly, this is a very important question, and I would like to take up a word that you mentioned, namely success. And I would actually argue that they have not been successful whatsoever in implementing policies. They've tried, but as I mentioned in my presentation, there was always this judicial constraint, the rule of law that made their policy implementations not really successful. So I would probably say that they have not been successful, even when in government, even when trying to push for their policies, they were somehow stopped by courts, and therefore very often they use symbolic policy making much more than substantial policy making, even when they're in government. And the Austrian case, I think it's a very nice example that once they're in government, they're not really successful because there are still democratic norms really stopping them. Nevertheless, and you can see that they lost lots of votes after they have been in government. Nevertheless, they have been successful in somehow implementing their ideas in the policy programs of what Katharina mentioned, of the center-right parties, the People's Party, the Christian Democratic parties, and so on, so that they are taking up their ideas in implementing them then when they are in government. So more or less they are already playing, or actually they are the parties doing the job of the illiberal forces. And I think the mainstream parties are not really aware of the fact that they are doing the job of others, even though they are criticizing them, even though they are trying to keep them out of the government, but they are then making their policies, making it the new normal as such. And this brings up something that I forgot to mention during my presentation, namely that these parties then also learn that they do not have to compromise, right? Because one main feature of illiberal parties that I observed throughout Europe is that compromise is not a word that they use, and definitely not a word that they implement. And why should they? They just push the other actors and then they do it anyhow for them. And this is also one of the reasons that, or one of the aspects that we could see, for example, in the coalition formation talks between the illiberal FPÖ and the conservative ÖVP in Austria, that they couldn't find a coalition agreement because the FPÖ did not want to compromise on any of the policies that were important to the ÖVP, but they really wanted their policies to put 100% in the coalition agreement. And to a certain extent, they do not have to compromise, because then new governments, other governments will take that up and will then probably prepare the ground for what is coming next. No compromise, destroying consensual democracies, as we have seen in Europe for many, many decades. And this is mainly also, from my perspective, due to the fact that the mainstream parties take up the policies of the illiberal parties and make it a success, while the illiberal parties themselves have not been successful when in government.
Thank you very much. I think two things stand out from this to me. One is that you are highlighting that they don't need to compromise, which very much resonates with their anti-pluralist position, since if they are the true representatives of the nation, which very often they claim to be, then any compromise would be kind of a betrayal from that position of those who they claim to represent, assuming that the might observe some sort of like consistency in these parties' positions, which very often actually we do not, nonetheless. And the other thing is that you are highlighting that they were not successful and retorted to symbolic politics, and you mentioned the role of judicial constraints. And I think that's very important because it highlights the centrality of the democratic institutional structures as checks and balances on the executive. I'm wondering, and here I want to bring in Batuhan before moving on to the French case. Do we see something like this constraining Meloni? Is it why she is still seen as, well, not that bad, we expected worse, and so on and so forth? Or are there other things at play that helps her to keep this image?
No, firstly, Silvia gave an amazing answer, actually, so I don't much to add. I think she's totally right. But I can add actually some Italian particularities to this answer, because Meloni's case is like it's like Schrodinger's cat, but in a far right form. Is she radical or not? Sometimes, because she is radical, yes, but she is doing a very good job to present herself sometimes as very pragmatist, and you can say, well, okay, she's doing fine in some cases, but sometimes she's extremely radical, especially in terms of norms, especially in terms of societal beliefs and traditions, in terms of gender issues, migration issues, etc. So, well, in case of Italy, I think this is one of the central issues that keep Meloni in power, because she has brought some stuff like economic stability, not an economic stability in a very ideal way, but, well, she has declined unemployment, which is a very, very important thing in Italy. And she used this a lot to actually, demonstrate that, okay, there is something positive going on. And apart from that, apart from these kind of domestic policy related issues, she has done a very good job in presenting herself, as I explained, as a mediator in this, in this burning world. Trump invited only her to the inauguration event when he became president again. So she positioned herself in a position in a role that she is a needed figure in international politics to bring different actors together. And this is why actually she hasn't been challenged a lot by other actors, even if she's a radical far right figure. There is this belief that, okay, we need her. And I think this is one of the issues that keep this demonstrates actually how international and domestic politics of far right and illiberal politics are very well connected. Because if you become successful in one of them, this can also bring success in the other one as well. And just another note, another point, I think this is very important for the rise of far right politics in general. She has done a very good job in destroying and eliminating her allies before her enemies. I mean, when you look at Salvini, when you look at Forza Italia, I mean, like 5 years ago, they were effective and active actors of Italian politics. But today, no one needs Salvini or Forza Italia anymore, because now they have a Meloni. She's sometimes doing well. So, and once she's done with, and I'm from Turkey, by the way, and this is what Erdogan has done very successfully as well. There is no other alternatives to Erdogan in right wing. And it is happening in Italy. You can see it in a country with a very strong center-right tradition since 90s. She's eliminating the alternatives, and now she's becoming only alternative actor that can continue this relative economic and political stability after 10 years of failed coalitions. So this is why she's still here, and she's here to stay if the progressives cannot do something against her. But this is a point that we can discuss maybe in another question.
Thank you very much. And indeed, the strategy that you're highlighting is also very, I think, typical and across the board, and certainly resonates also with the Hungarian experience, where Viktor Orbán and Fidesz, first of all, wanted to dominate the right. And indeed was very successful in doing so, either by sidelining or incorporating, co-opting other right-wing forces. We write about also this in our Hungarian country paper. Katerina, I'm turning to you with our closing question, I believe, and ask you to, I know you will love this, but nonetheless, to speculate a little bit about what could we expect should the Rassemblement National manage to enter executive office and especially win the presidential election. How would the strong institutions manage to nonetheless safeguard the republic?
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a difficult question. So just one thing related to the previous discussion, we're very, very, very brief, because I completely subscribe to what Sylvia and Batuan have been saying. But I think it's also important to point out that the influence of the far right on policy is more likely to be found through agenda setting than lawmaking, right? I mean, this means basically that where these parties are particularly good is not necessarily, as Sylvia said already and Batuan already, in changing or redirecting policies, but in changing and in shifting public debates on issues that are at the core of their campaigns. The second thing, and then I go to the French elections. The influence of far-right parties on policy has also very little to do with, formal government participation, for the reasons I just mentioned, but also with electoral strength. I like to bring the example of UKIP and the EU referendum, right? At that time, the Conservative Party called for a referendum under the pressure of UKIP, that by then was scoring electorally really, really low. So this means basically that if we need to think about the policy impact of the far right, it's better to think in the light of what we know also from research, more in terms of agenda setting rather than, policy redirection. Going to the French elections, I don't have a crystal ball, so I'm very uncomfortable with doing predictions, but I think that the results, and it's probably very, very hard to tell at this stage. I think that the results will pretty much depend less from the Rassemblement National itself than from the mainstream right and the mainstream left. The Front National is doing very well electorally. I mean, they are supported, and I don't think that even the trial that Marine Le Pen is undergoing will have a negative impact on them. I think that they are doing the job, and they are doing it well, because they are not losing popularity, and even the change in leadership with Jordan Bardella didn't alter the general popularity of the party. So on their side, where the story becomes more complex is when it comes to the mainstream parties again, right? I mean, the Socialist Party in France, or the Social Democrats, is basically inexistent today. I mean, it scores very, very low, and it is increasingly fragmented. At the moment, actually, the left, ranging from the Social Democrats to the French Communist Party, including La France Insoumise, the Unbound France, were not able to find a common agreement, right? So for the moment, the scenario we have is that there will be, for the presidential elections, a primary election that will include the Greens, the Socialist parties, and La France Insoumise will run by itself, and the French Communist Party as well. So the left is divided. In the mainstream right spectrum, then things are also, pretty much fragmented, because the Les Républicains, that is the Gaullist conservative party in France, is incredibly fragmented internally. There are different political leanings that are represented inside the party, some that are really, really close to the Rassemblement National, and some that are actually a bit farther than that. So depending on what faction of the party will prevail, we will probably also see whether the mainstream conservatives in France will support or not a unitary coalition, at least at the second round of the right. So it's really difficult to forecast, because there are, let's say, too many variables that we need to take into account to adjust. But I think that I can't give you an answer whether the Front National will win or not, but I think that whether it wins or loses, again, will depend on the behavior of mainstream parties. And it will also depend on, like the issues they will decide to politicize in public debates. Will we still talking about Islam and Muslim presences? Or we will start talking about, like the issues that are most important for French citizens, like cost of living, right? If you look at the Eurobarometer data, it stands out. So I would say that the ball is in the field of the mainstream parties again.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And I think this links back with a point that Batuhan was mentioning earlier, that democratic actors need to engage with the concerns of the citizens. And you mentioned here the cost of living. I think across Europe, this is an increasingly important topic that we see topping the main concerns of the voters. So there would be, in fact, room to thematize non-far right agenda points by the mainstream. And again, I fully agree, and we need to underscore this again and again, that we will not have lasting, sustainable, liberal democracies without democratically committed mainstream parties, both on the left and the right. And adopting the strategies, talking points, agendas of illiberal parties is doing exactly the opposite. We try to highlight many of these dynamics throughout our AUTHLIB project, and we try to discuss them in more detail, country by country, across 7 cases in the UK, Great Britain, France, Italy, the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, and Poland, to give an overview about how they have been playing out and what we need to watch in the coming years. I would like to thank Batuhan, Silvia, and Katarina for giving us some insights into their respective case studies. I have shared the link in the chat to all of the country reports that are already on the website. And also, you all have been talking about data regarding voters' attitudes. So I also want to give a shout out to our AUTHLIB's interactive dashboard, where you can actually find the data that has been collected about voters, but also about parties and politicians, their positions, attitudes, by all teams involved in the AUTHLIB project. So with that, I would like to just thank you once again for being here today, sharing your insights with us. And I would also like to thank our audience for joining us on a Monday morning and starting your week by listening to us about far-right politics in Europe. I think that kind of signals that it is a big and noteworthy challenge that we all have an interest in following and tackling. With that, I'm also actually closing the last AUTHLIB event of the project. And this will also be posted on our YouTube channel. So thank you very much for following along, and still follow us on social media as we round everything out. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.